All right, on to our speaker. Her name is Sarah Rovner. Is that correct?
Rovner.
Rovner. Of course, I had to screw that up. Sarah is an FAA safety team lead representative from Houston, Texas, who enjoys educating general aviation and airline pilots. She's an FTD instructor for new hires at a Part 121 airline and conducts procedures, validations, and training on crew resource management, what we like to call CRM. We like acronyms here. Threat and error management and emergency procedures. Having flown over 70 unique types of airplanes in challenging environments, her experience extends beyond the airlines. She has presented at many events, including previous AirVentures and the Women in Aviation Conference. Please welcome Sarah Rovner.
Thanks everybody for coming out to this year's AirVenture. I hope you guys have had a good time. The weather's been beautiful. Everybody would probably agree with that. It's outside of maybe one storm so far. Who out here's camping?
Mike sounds good.
Who here flew in? Okay, who here flew in over 1,000 miles for the event? Anybody? Okay. Well, welcome to AirVenture. Welcome to the FAA Safety Center. As you can see, we have a different topic about every hour. Today I'm going to be presenting on a phenomenon that you may or may not know about called the normalization of deviance. Who here has heard that term before? If you're probably a professional pilot, you've probably heard that term before, or even if you're in the engineering or process engineering industry, that term is also common there as well. So I always like to start out all my presentations with a quote, and this one is from Sully Sullenberger. I also like to give this to my students as well when they first start. We need to try to do the right thing every time to perform at our best, because we never know what moment in our lives we'll be judged on. Those words couldn't be more true. Every day we do routine things, make routine flights. You never know when that moment's going to come where everybody's going to be scrutinizing your actions. And are your actions correct, and have you been doing the right thing? A little bit about me. So I'm a current line pilot with SkyWest and an FTD instructor. So the new hire airline pilots come to the procedures trainers to get instruction on checklists, flows, call-outs, if you guys are familiar with the airline world, as well as how the airlines deal with emergency procedures and crew resource management, which might be slightly different than what you're used to as a general aviation pilot. Who here is a professional pilot? And everybody else who's a hobby pilot? Yeah, aviation is still a hobby even though it's now work for me. My previous experience was with project management and engineering experience with the oil and gas industry. And the normalization of deviance is a term that's often found in that industry as well. I'm the owner and a ferry pilot at Full Throttle Aviation. It's an international aircraft delivery company. I'm a fast team lead representative from the Houston FSDO, and I continue to fly general aviation, namely Super Cubs and the occasional air tractor. So overview of our presentation, we're going to talk about the phenomenon. We're going to talk about probably the two most well-known instances where the term normalization of deviance has come to light. We're going to talk about intentional procedure noncompliance, procedural drift, where we make wrong a little bit more right, what can we do about it, and then I'll give the references that I use for the presentation. So I'm sure you've all gotten away with this before. So do you guys think that that was the only day that he probably flew overweight or right at the limits of his capabilities? Probably not. He's probably done it many times before, and as you can see, he was right there on the line and just narrowly got away with it. How many times do you guys fly right there on the line and get away with it? He probably didn't think anything of it. Oh, I've done this before. I've gotten in and out of the short strip. Yeah, the book says that I need 2,000 feet, but I can do it in 1,500. How many people have heard that one before? And they've consistently gotten out of 1,500-foot strips, and they say, oh, I can do it, until that one time where you just don't have enough margins and something happens. So sociologist Diane Vaughn was responsible for coining the term normalization of deviance based on her study of the culture of NASA prior to the Challenger disaster. Who here remembers the Challenger disaster? before we had high definition TV, but it was one of the biggest disasters in aviation history. And so the term normalization of deviance was coined after the Challenger disaster as a result of the phenomenon that occurred that led up to that disaster. Just as we've seen time and time before, accidents are generally not just one little thing that goes wrong. It's a combination, it's a chain of events, things that have happened over time, in this case, the culture of the organization. And although the term is mostly used in the aerospace industry, this concept continues to be prevalent in organizational safety and behavior science. So what is the normalization of deviance? The normalization of deviance is when behaviors begin to drift from the standards and become the normal over time. When all of us learned to drive or took our driving tests, how long do we pause at a stop sign? 1 second, 2 seconds, I guess depends on your state. Maybe wait for the rollback. How many people continue stopping fully at a stop sign even now? Everybody should raise their hands because we all do it. Well, some people over time, okay, now I'm just going to pause for a second. It's going to become a pause sign. Well, now I'm just going to kind of roll through it by looking both ways. Well, now I'm just going to disregard the stop sign. The concept behind the normalization of deviance is that every time the behavior begins to drift from the standards, it gets reinforced with no consequences, and over time, it drifts and drifts and drifts and drifts until somebody runs a stop sign and gets T-boned. People within the organization become so accustomed to a deviant behavior that they don't even consider it as deviant. When was the last time you called out your friend for not stopping completely at a stop sign? You don't say, hey, you didn't stop completely at that stop sign. It's because the deviant behavior is probably not considered deviant in your mind, even though most behavioral scientists would argue that not stopping at a stop sign would be a deviant social behavior. And Vaughn's work has found that people become more accustomed to the behavior, but more it occurs. How many people have seen that within an organization? Cutting corners, this is how we do it here. Over time, we become accustomed to it. So let's talk about the Challenger disaster. We've gotten away with it before. That's exactly what happened. The Challenger disaster happened in 1981, over 5 years before the actual disaster occurred. The issues were discovered with the O-rings in 1981. If you guys are familiar with what happened was the O-rings that they were using to seal the rocket boosters were defective. And so they were leaking over time, and that's what ended up causing the disaster. Engineers, after discovering the issue in 1981, came up with a fix, but it did not completely solve the problem. And so they continued to do test flights and observe the flaw with no consequence. Well, it worked fine all these different times, over and over and over again. They knew it was flawed. They continued testing it, but there were no consequences. But they still knew there was something wrong. It just became normal. Flying with the flaw became normal and acceptable. The deviant behavior continued with no consequences at all. It worked all those different times. And then unfortunately, on January 28, 1986, the Challenger blew up 73 seconds after takeoff as a result of the flaws. How many times have we seen that before? It's been fine all this time, and then all of a sudden one day something just happens. But you shouldn't have been flying with that to begin with. Who's responsible for this? Was it the engineers at Morton Thiel? Was it NASA? Was it the pilots? Who was responsible for this disaster? The idea behind the normalization of deviance is that the problem lies within the organization, or even the pilots themselves, the people who are conducting that. NASA had allowed the flaws to continue. Morton Thiel had allowed the flaws to continue. And unfortunately, the people who paid for it were the people aboard the Challenger. So when you're thinking about that, hey, is this my problem? It sure is. It's everybody's responsibility to make sure that you don't deviate from the standards, and eventually cutting corners over time causes a disaster like the Challenger. Who here is familiar with the Carnival cruise ship? Everybody heard that. Tradition can be a dangerous word. Who here has heard that before? This is how we do it here. It's tradition to do this. This is what we've been doing all these years. We've seen dangerous traditions time and time again, whether it's in popular movies, within our organizations, within aviation. Well, for a very long time, a tradition was developing at Concordia. What was happening is that cruise ships started passing near the coastline because management thought that it was free advertising to drive close to the shore in order to advertise the cruise ships. So even though this was a completely unapproved route, and they weren't supposed to be anywhere near any of that land, they continued doing it because it was encouraged by management. And they kept getting away with it, and getting away with it, and getting away with it, over and over and over again. The deviant behavior continued with no consequence. If there's one thing that I could highlight on here, it would be that. Over time, we continue to do the deviant behavior with no consequence. This is the important part of the normalization of deviance. We're so used to it doing it that it becomes normal. This behavior was the norm, and each captain deviated from the normal path. Each person was doing it. But yet the one we all know was the one who got caught. How many times we see that? Everybody gets away with it, but this one got caught. Ship was too close to the island in one of the risky ship salutes before it went into the submerged rocks. And on January 13th, 2012, the Costa Concordia crashed into rocks off Agilago Island, killing 32 people. So who's responsible for this? Who says the captain? I'd venture to say that the organization was part of it too, right? The leadership? Who was encouraging these ship salutes? Did the captain just decide to go off the deviant path on his own? Chances are, if you're a new hire driving a ship, you're probably going to do things by the book until over time people are like, oh, we'll get a little bit closer to shore. They love that. You know, management says, yeah, hey, it's free advertising. Go ahead and do that. And then all your peers are doing it. And then everybody starts doing it. And next thing you know, 10 years later, you're the one who finally hits the rocks and a bunch of people die. They actually brought criminal charges against the captain in this case, even though I would definitely argue that the organization had to be a part of it. Where were his peers? They were encouraging the deviant behavior. Management encouraging the deviant behavior. The captain was only doing what the organization put out there. Who here has heard of the LOSA program, Line Operation Safety Audits? So in the 1990s, really a little bit before that, there was a big push to try to reduce aviation accidents. Everybody can probably remember a time where they made the joke, you know, flying was dangerous, everything else was safe. But for a very long time, they were trying to fight the problem with accidents. And as we all know, more than 80% of accidents are the result of pilot error. In particular, a lot of different human factors issues. And so as a result, there were a bunch of different programs that came out in the 90s, and one of them was the Line Operation Safety Audit, which came around just after the birth of CRM. Well, CRM had been around for a little bit longer before that, but it was a real push with it in the 1990s. And what they want to do with this program is they want to identify areas in the airline where people aren't complying with procedures. Even for general aviation pilots, how many of you guys comply with procedures 100% of the time? And so what people would do is they would sit on the jump seat of the airliner and they would observe. And they would look for situations where people were intentionally not complying with the published procedures. For example, skipping a checklist, continuing an unstabilized approach, ducking below a glide slope outside of published procedures. Who here has done any of that before? We've all done it. And believe it or not, it's more common than you think. In fact, maintenance shortcuts account for a large percent of intentional procedure noncompliance. Who here always complies to the maintenance by the book? Always. If you look at the actual regulations, it does allow private pilots and airplane owners to do a lot of their own maintenance, but there's a lot of stuff that's not quite approved. I have definitely pulled up to the airport before to see somebody who does not know, who cannot even put together IKEA furniture, definitely not an AMP, you know, changing out a generator in their airplane. It's probably not approved. How many people you know do their own avionics work, pull their avionics out? That's also, depending on the type of airplane and the situation, a lot of the times not approved. It happens a lot. People are always doing these behaviors, and you know what? Nothing happens. Oh, I replaced the generator just fine. I replaced the magneto just fine. I did the timing myself. I pulled the prop off and replaced it, and it was just fine. Time and time again. Who knows people who just work on their own airplanes? They're not supposed to. Probably all seen them at the airport. Believe it or not, airline pop-up aircraft malfunctions are mismanaged 16% of the time. 16% of the time. With crews using shortcuts such as pulling a circuit breaker to save time. That's a whole amount of mechanical problems that are not being treated according to the procedure. And as they found out, as the number of intentional noncompliance issues increase on a flight, the number of mismanaged threats increase. And they found in the study that on 49% of the flights in his organization's archive, the reporter reported at least one intentional noncompliance procedure error. 50% of the time, people are taking shortcuts. Now, you might think it's something small, like pausing at a stop sign. Probably not a big deal, but over time, as those behaviors increase, not only are you increasing the amount of threats that come up, but it's also statistically shown that you're more likely to mismanage an error or an undesired aircraft state if it does come up. That comes on to another subject called procedural drift. Who here has heard about procedural drift? So procedural drift is when flight crews drift away from how things are written. How many people go somewhere or they fly somewhere or you flew with an instructor or a friend who says, no, this is just how I do things. They do something weird. I've seen so many weird things in the airplane. I think I heard a funny seminar once where one guy, stuck his tongue out in the direction that he was turning before each turn. So, people do all kinds of different things. They do a run up a certain way. Well, the book says I need to run it up to 1700 RPM, but, I'm just going to do 1300 RPM. How many people know people like that? They think they know the airplane more than the book does, and they don't follow the correct procedure. Or occurrences of intentional noncompliance are a way of measuring an organization's procedural drift. Happens all the time. So maybe you have a friend who never runs up their engine on their airplane. That's something that's required per the manufacturer's checklist. Well, over time, they measure procedural drift based on how many times those occurrences happen. One question you should be asking yourself is, how far do you let yourself drift? Is it just something small like changing a generator on your airplane, or are you performing overhauls in your backyard? And that would be an example of procedural drift. So everybody's quick to say safety first, but is that really what we do? Outside pressures encourage shortcutting of safety measures. For example, if you have to be somewhere and you discover an issue with your airplane, how many people have discovered a rough running mag you just can't get to stop and you took off anyway? I'd say it's happened definitely more than people like to admit. Oh, I got to be there. All I got to do is get to the next stop. It happens all the time. It happens all the time in the airlines. It happens all the time for hobby flyers. And a lot of times when we look at accidents after they happen, there's been a history of this behavior. And a good example of that was there was an explosion at one of the plants in my area. And what they had found was that people had not been doing their appropriate checks every night. And they said, oh, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. And over time, it ended up causing an issue. And when they did the investigation after it, they found that that had been happening more and more. They found that each person had not been doing the appropriate checks. And so it was no surprise when something like that happens that there had been a history of this behavior occurring. How many times do we see an accident where there was a history of the person not checking their fuel and they took off with water in the tanks? How many times do people do something wrong or they do something small wrong and then it ends up adding up into an accident? Cultural norms that make deviation from the procedures acceptable. It's acceptable to pause at a stop sign. It's acceptable to skip a checklist. But you're the cool guy. You're not going to sit there and read every little line by the book. That's exactly what happens as part of our culture. And that culture is what fosters the phenomenon of the normalization of deviance. Maintenance. This is probably a really, really big one. A lot of people tend to take shortcuts when it comes down to maintenance. Maintenance is expensive. We all know it. Who here normally pays more than $1,000 for their annual? I could probably even go the number to 5,000. I'd probably still see some hands. Maintenance is expensive. Fixing things the right way is expensive. And it was for Morton Thiokol too. If they were to have gone back and tried to fix everything from the beginning, the project would have been delayed many years and a lot of money. If you actually look at the investigation that ensued, it would have been expensive to do things the right way, but they'd been getting away with it for so long. They had been flying with the flaws. Nothing had happened. Over and over and over again, things were going the way they needed them to until it finally bit them. Weight and balance. We saw the picture of the airplane taken off earlier today. How many people here have never flown overweight in an airplane? Never. Okay. Maybe some people by the book.
I don't have enough time to have done that yet.
Yes. But a lot of people get away with that. One time I was sitting there at the airport. It was like a 100-degree day. And I saw 4 big people, not big people, to the point they had to work to get the doors closed, get into a 172 right after topping it off. What are the chances that they were underweight? But how many people get away with it? I've definitely never done anything like that before. But the reason I'm talking here today is because maybe I've gotten away with it. But the idea is that you get away with it over and over again. You think it's normal, and then it ends up biting you. Those guys probably took off and had an uneventful flight in that 172, even though they took all 5,000 feet of the runway. It was probably an uneventful flight. How many times do you think they've done it before? A brand new private pilot, I almost guarantee you, is going to weigh each of their people or ask for a truthful number. Now, that can be a whole other topic to have. If you're going to give them a truthful number, I know that when people ask me how much I weigh, for safety reasons, you got to be honest. How many times, a private pilot's going to sit there and count every little person and do it all right? And then what happens when you've been flying for 6 months? And now a year, and now your friend wants to come at the last minute. He says, well, we'll probably be okay. We'll probably be okay. Next thing you know, you're just flying. You're not even asking people their weight, and you're taking off and putting whatever you can in the airplane. Oshkosh is the best place to see this, too. You can see them taxiing in, and every time they hit a bump, the tail almost hits the ground. And I'm not quite sure they're quite in CG, but I'm sure you've seen that with the low-hanging tails that sit about 1 foot above the ground because the entire back compartment is crammed with camping gear. Have they done a proper weight and balance? And guess what? They got here just fine until that one time that they're not fine. And then they're quick to say, well, everybody does it, but they had an opportunity to make it right and stop doing that. Checklists used. Who here uses a checklist? Now in the airlines, we do checklists a little bit differently than probably a lot of general aviation pilots do. Instead of using a read and do list, there are some read and do lists. A lot of times we have a flow or a way that we do something, and then we follow it up with a checklist to make sure we didn't forget anything. That being said, for general aviation pilots, I'm definitely a proponent of using more than just one technique. The idea behind CRM, aeronautical decision making, threat and error management, is making sure that you cover all your bases. You don't forget anything, like the gear. You don't ever want to forget the gear. The idea is that you have some method of making sure that you accomplish all the tasks that you need to before that ends. Now, I'm not saying that if you're at a Cessna 172, you need to read line by line, but whatever procedure that you use, whether it's a flow or a do list or a checklist, whatever you want to use, you're making sure you get all those items, not skipping anything. How many people skip stuff on the checklist? According to his study, it happens all the time. And that's considered intentional procedure noncompliance. It's not like you didn't forget it. It's just you chose not to do that, like a run-up. What about pre-flight planning? How many people check NOTAMs all the time? Every single time. I remember I was flying a Sonex. I was just south of Minneapolis, and I picked a little airport to land at, and I read the NOTAMs ahead of time. The big runway was closed, and they were doing some construction. And so I call in the CTAF, say, hey, I'm inbound for landing. And the guy says, well, have you read the NOTAMs? And he sounded frustrated. And I was like, man, why is this guy mad at me? I just called in saying I was inbound for landing. I was like, yes, I read your NOTAMs. This runway was closed. He's like, well, you're the first person today to know that runway was closed. And I even got $1 a gallon discount on fuel. I was the only pilot that day that had read the NOTAMs. When you do start doing stuff like North Atlantic ferrying, international ferrying, reading NOTAMs can be the difference between life and death. If you're making one of those long legs out to Greenland and you didn't read the NOTAM that approach is out of service, and you get there, your closest airport to divert to with good weather might be 300 miles away, and you'll run out of gas getting there. Of course, 99.9% of the time in the U.S., if you don't read a NOTAM, there's probably an airport within 10 miles away. Maybe if you're out in the mountainous areas, not so much so. But it's a big deal. How many times have we gotten away with not reading NOTAMs? Who here has ever got caught off guard by a NOTAM? I'll be the first one to raise my hand. I have gotten caught off guard by a NOTAM before. And you know what? It's probably ended up okay until that one time that it doesn't. Because you've become so accustomed to not checking NOTAMs, it had not been part of your process. When you're a brand new pilot, learning to fly, doing your solo cross countries, you were checking those NOTAMs left and right. But over time, you become accustomed to something, and you stop doing it. It becomes normal, and then it ends up biting you one day. What about TFRs? Who here has ever violated a temporary flight restriction? You don't have to be honest with this one. I've definitely got caught off guard by a TFR before, especially when they started doing the stadium TFRs, which weren't listed on the FAA's website. Remember the NOTAM, I believe, was 95151 that said any stadium with a seating capacity, a certain amount, within 3 miles and up to 3,000 feet, there's a NOTAM. That caught a lot of people off guard. There's a lot of things that people know. Now, part of that might be the absence of knowledge, which is a little bit different than the normalization of deviance. But for the most part, this phenomenon could happen to anybody if you're not used to looking for TFRs. What about limitations compliance? Engine warm-ups, run-ups? Who here flies an airplane where you have to have the oil temperature a certain amount before you can take off? If you fly a lot of vintage airplanes, radials, those engines are even more picky. Limitations compliance, making sure that you comply with what the manufacturer says for the airplane. Some airplanes have really weird starting procedures, really weird run-up procedures, weird warm-up procedures. But people get accustomed to doing things a certain time. How many times you're like, oh man, I'm in a hurry. I know it's 20 degrees out and the engine's only, the oil temperature's only at, 30 degrees. I'm just going to take off anyway. People have done that before. Now, of course, if you own the airplane, you'll probably be a little bit more hesitant because you'll be buying a new engine soon, if not having, more issues on takeoff. But people do it all the time. And they find it time and time again in an accident investigation that people have been doing these behaviors over time. So here's the big question. What can we do about it? We all know this happens. Everybody cuts corners. I mean, whether or not you're stopping at a stop sign, crossing the street, in a lot of different places, it's actually a legal requirement to cross at a crosswalk. But how many people cut kidney quarter across the street? Especially here. How many people have you seen outside today crossing the street without looking while texting? Almost getting run over. There was a funny video. I was actually trying to find it for the presentation that had a woman who was sitting there texting and walked right into a water fountain in the middle of a mall. I couldn't believe it. I mean, she did not see it coming, just straight over into the water fountain. People get accustomed to doing it. Texting and driving, it kills people all the time. But they do it so many times with no consequence, it becomes normal. For me, I still get a little bit nervous when I see somebody texting and driving. But when was the last time that you looked over to your driver and says, hey, maybe you shouldn't be texting? Or has it become acceptable? It's become almost acceptable behavior. But what we need to do is we need to stop the chain before it occurs. In other words, we need to stop that reinforcement of that deviant behavior. Now, whether or not that's reaching out to your friend and saying, hey, maybe you should do a weight and balance for this flight. Those people look really big. Maybe it's saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't text and drive. Just little corrections like that go a long way. All it takes is a little bit of being able to break that chain, to break that reinforcement of the deviant behavior, and it doesn't continue. Positive reinforcement of deviant behaviors. Every time somebody gets away with it, that's positive reinforcement. Wow, I can't believe I pulled that off. Just like the video we saw earlier. Wow, that was close. I can't believe I pulled it off. You think those guys were laughing in that airplane? Probably. Probably laughing, wow, that was so close. Ha ha ha. Maybe it might have been a nervous laugh, once the adrenaline kind of fades off. But they were thinking, wow, I just got away with that. How many times have we just thought, wow, I can't believe I just got away with that? What we want to do is we need to intervene, counteract the problem. You don't think it's a big deal? Probably not this one time, probably not tomorrow, probably not next week. But as you could see from the Challenger disaster...
Do you want to take a question?
Oh. No.
Okay. Keep going.
Oh, okay. Probably not next week, but as you can see from the Challenger disaster, it took years of that problem before something kind of caught up to them. Over and over again. We can see what a culture of non-compliance can create. It's exactly what happened with Morton Thiokol in the Challenger disaster. It's exactly what happened with Concordia. Intentional procedure non-compliance, over and over and over again. These people got away with it. It was okay, it was acceptable, we saved money, free advertising, all these good things that breaking the rules did. Look what happens. Eventually does catch up to everybody. What you need to do is follow the aeronautical decision-making process and choose to make decisions in the interest of safety. And sometimes that can be hard to do. Sometimes it can be. It can be expensive. It can be inconvenient. But what you need to do is you need to make the right decision because you know over time where those decisions will lead. Some of the references that I used. And now I'll take any questions if anybody has them.
This is just a little bit of comment. I love all this. This is what you need to do if you want to, even if you're a hobby pilot, you want to be more professional. I think in the context of here in EAA, it's experimental. A lot of people do things without a standard. And I just wanted to bring that up because a friend of mine, for example, was, had a neighbor, and he was into Reno air racing. And he made some modifications for performance reasons. And clearly, this is outside of any norms, right? He's in the experimental category. He can do whatever he wants. And he did have the opportunity for outside counsel to tell him, hey, what you're trying to do, I think, is going to end up very badly. He did not take that advice, and he ended up with that big crash a few years back at Reno. So one more layer to what we're talking about now is normalization of deviance. I just want to bring that up of, within the experimental community, use resources to help even things that are on the edge to get a little bit further away from the edge.
No, definitely, I agree. And with the experimental category, it's kind of hard. If they're like, let's say, in this situation, there really is no procedure for how things are done. There's no SOP that says, well, in this kind of case, you're going into unfound territory. An example of the normalization of deviance would be, though, let's say you develop this great new product, this great new engine, it makes airplanes go the speed of sound on 5 gallons an hour. Let's say you develop this great technology. We'd all love that. I would love it, personally. Well, now let's say you just found a flaw in your design, but you didn't want anybody to know about it, so you hid it. Or you continued flying with the flaw, saying, well, it's not really doing what I want it to do, but it's okay. How many people have heard a mechanic say that? Or, even one of their friends, oh, well, it's not really doing what I want it to do it, but it's probably okay. That would be an example of that. Maybe if you're not sure if something is being done properly according to the regs or the procedures, then you could reach out, just like what he said, to somebody who's maybe done it before. Make sure that you're doing it the correct way, because, yeah, it might be working all these different times, but you know that it's not supposed to be doing it that way. And over time, that could create a problem. Anybody else have any questions?
Yep, just one second.
Hold on, he's
going to
bring a microphone
over to you.
I'm sure there are more questions, but I wondered if you could replay that video for those that weren't here.
Oh, okay.
At the beginning of while we're taking questions.
This is the video. Tail even comes back right there on the ground. The guy that just narrowly got away with it. See there, normalization of deviance, saying he's good. And that was a good pilot right there. Look at him pull that off. Reinforcement of deviant behaviors right there.
Just one little slogan. I had an engineer, I worked in explosives. You can play Russian roulette forever if you're really good at it. Okay.
Very true. How many times, what are the chances of something happening? There's like a 1% chance that I'm going to get caught. Maybe when you're a kid, hey, there's a 1% I'm going to get caught with this. What are the chances? What are the chances Customs is going to catch my bag full of oranges? I'm not going to declare it. Don't do that in Canada. They're really serious about their agriculture in Canada. Very serious.
So if I heard you right, you're a ferry pilot, which
Yes,
means
sir.
you're going to take risks, but the mission requires it. So what you do is you try to mitigate the risks as much as possible, but the mission inherently carries some risk. What's frustrating is watching people who should be on a flight that has little or no risk, who just needlessly add risk by piling all the friends, all the camping equipment, all the fuel, everything. in there. Do you have any thoughts on like the approach that a ferry pilot has or somebody like that has to try to minimize the risk and what the mindset is there?
Yes, I actually do a presentation as well on risk management. The theory behind risk management is, number one, you want to accept no unnecessary risk, period. There's no reason that you should accept unnecessary risk. Unnecessary risk might be flying with inoperative equipment, especially as a ferry pilot. That's unnecessary risk. You could go ahead and fix that. Now, the idea behind risk is you want to minimize it, transfer it, eliminate it, mitigate it as much as possible. But yes, some missions are going to require risk. If you are crop dusting, a lot of the world relies on aerial applicators for their crops, especially in certain countries where the ground is too wet to apply it by ground. Well, that's an inherently risky job. You're flying fast, you're flying low to the ground, so what do you do to mitigate that? You train, you get good training, you survey the field, you get training on the chemicals, you get training on the airplane, and you do what you can to mitigate the risk. Now, from a ferry pilot perspective, it's the same way. Yes, there's going to be risk involved. You're flying an unknown airplane, you're flying into a hostile territory with not a whole lot of options for diversion, but you do what you can to minimize that, and you do that by checking the weather, double and triple checking performance. For me, I even studied currents to determine, microclimates and weather phenomenons that occur in certain areas of the world. You need to have a good understanding of that information. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is one of the best ways of eliminating risk, knowing what you're getting into, knowing about the systems in your airplane, and making sure that you don't take any extra risk where you don't need to. Do you really need to take, the most deluxe tent in the world when you're by yourself? Do you really need all of that stuff? Even as a hobby pilot, if you're thinking about all of that, don't take any unnecessary risk. None. You take only the risks that you have to, and even then you pick your battles. Any other questions? Oh. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I'd like to thank you all for coming out today.